Well, welcome, friends and brothers and sisters, newcomers to our podcast, Deep Transformation, and our ever-growing community of listeners and participants in this field that we're creating together. And I'm John Dupuy, co-host with Dr. Roger Walsh. And if you're listening to this, hi, Roger. We're back together again. It's always amazing. And today we have it sounds like such a cliche to have a special guest, it's like everybody says that. Sometimes I want to say today we have a really boring person because we couldn't get anybody else, but that hasn't happened. So anyway, we have a dear friend, well, two dear friends and colleagues, actually. Dr. Bob Weathers, who, if this is on YouTube, you can see that beautiful, handsome man. Behind all the books. Or there's two beautiful, handsome men behind books. But anyway, let's move on. And Colette Baron-Reid. And Colette is a really interesting person. And she has a very long bio. But I just want to read the first paragraph because I like it. Colette Baron-Reid, she, her. Oh, yeah, right. Got it. I'm going to know that stuff. Bestselling author, internationally acclaimed Oracle expert, spiritual intuitive, personal transformation thought leader, business strategist, artist, educator. In other words, she's unemployed. Just kidding. And we've done various projects over the years, and thanks, Colette. It's always a great grace and a blessing to see you. And she's also the head honcho, is that right? The head honcho for the Wooniverse podcast, which is an amazing and a very successful, just as you'll soon see as I let somebody else talk, why it's so popular and why she's doing so well in that. And again, with Bob, he is his professional work now is working with addicts and alcoholics. And I wrote a book about it some time ago. And it was influential with some people, and it's a really good book. It was mainly channeled, I'm sure, but we became connected that way. And I was doing online counseling with addicts and alcoholics for a number of years until my wife said, "Okay, John, that's enough." And we had our house full of addicts for 8 years. This became a treatment center, and 24/7. So I did get some on the ground experience. And I was also addicted to cigarettes for many years, so I do have some addiction. But I've been in the trenches, and Bob is one of the first people I call when people call me up and they need somebody to counsel with, to talk to work with. He's the top of my list. And anyway, I just feel so happy that we're all here. And today we're going to try to dig in, and as we're not really guided much but by the flow of the spirit in these conversations. But I was talking with Roger last night, and he mentioned something, said the new face of addiction, which I thought might be a really good title for this. So I'd like to go in, the big picture. What do we see going on in our civilization and culture and our countries with addiction? And we've gone through the pandemic, et cetera, and how you see things going right now in the field, and how it is with your own personal journey, because both of you are in recovery for a long time and have come back and, through the fires, purified and full of love, compassion, and wisdom, which is what recovery tends to do if you do the work. So anyway, thank you, welcome, and God bless you guys. And who wants to start this thing rolling besides me?
It's great to be here. Thank you for that introduction, John. And Colette, I'm really happy to hear that you're in recovery as well. I look forward to wherever our conversation might take us. That's really a joy to know. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, well, I'll start then.
Sure.
So 37 and a half years clean and sober, a day at a time, actually more than that now, but you asked about it, the bigger picture. So I know for me, it's been interesting to see the way addiction has morphed in our society. For me, I grew up, there was no internet. There was no, I mean, you know, I'm 65, so we're going to go way back to when I started in the 70s and got clean and sober in 1986. And January 2nd, actually, so a day at a time. But then it was cocaine. It was, you know, it was all kinds of different drugs for me, and sex addiction, things that were not, they weren't like cultural so much, although we had a subculture with drug, you know, with cocaine and the nightclubs, etc. But now, you know, when I look around, I see us with our gadgets, and I see the kind of addictions that have taken place now. You know, the addiction to disconnection and dissociation, and even now with everybody tooting all the I mean, and I understand that the conversation around trauma is important, etc. But I'm finding even the addiction to identify yourself as traumatized, or somehow, like, without being in any way disrespectful, because I come from trauma. I mean, I was, you know, I had a lot of violence that happened to me in my early 20s. I mean, I have a whole list of reasons why I should be a victim. But I think that, you know, that there's something going on that's really dissolving. It's fragmentation. It's just really scary, I think, the way this has gone, you know. Anyway, but for me, my entire reason for being clean and sober is not just service, but it's a conscious contact to a higher power. That is the one thing that has created my entire life, is knowing that my relationship to a higher power is my number one priority, and everything else is secondary. Ego sublimation, you know, that's anyway. Somebody else take the ball now, because I literally could talk solid for an hour and a half, just like John.
Yeah, I wanted to yell hallelujah, amen with the last thing you said, but you also said something about the fragmentation. And before you give up the speaking, yeah, what do you mean by that?
So I don't know. Addiction was more social when I was an addict. You know, now it's just the addiction is disconnection, right? So we become more fragmented as we become more and more disconnected. Like, even the fact you go to the grocery store, you can't even talk. You have to self-checkout. Like the loneliness and the, you know, not being able to communicate, and false sense of communication. You know, you have counterfeit relationships because people band together about what they hate, or they come together for the very different reasons now. So the fragmentation part is that there's a real lack of cohesion, and so much, not even what I want to say separation. I don't know why I'm not that articulate today. I'm usually a lot better with my words. But, you know, the idea that we are so polarized, you know, that's also what I mean. It's just scary.
Yeah.
It's scary, you know,
and
because I'm
there's
a middle of the road girl. Very not the most flat, like, you know, it's not the popular position, because I believe that everything comes back to center, and coherence is where we need to be, in harmony. Peacenik here, but it's not happening. Now I'll give up the ball. Roger.
I wanted to just draw out one of the implications of what you were saying, Colette, because I think it's really important. And there was an implication in what you said. First off, that the objects of addiction have changed, and in very dramatic ways, and that you talked about. Some people even talk about victimology, or the addiction to being the attraction and even addiction to that role. So we can become attached, addicted to substances, to gadgets, to stimulation of any kind, including, and of course, different roles and different identities. Mm-hmm. And I think the implication you're pointing to is that basically a universal addiction, that by nature, there is a tendency to addiction, and never more succinctly stated than by the Buddha in his second noble truth: the cause of suffering is addiction. Mm-hmm. And full stop. And, you know, we want to end suffering, third noble truth, really reduce addiction. So I think it helps to to put it in the universal context, that this is something all of us are wired for in a way, and have to work with at various levels, some more dramatically, such as yourself, others more like myself, fortunately, more around more subtle things. But of course, that could change.
It's ironic. It's ironic. Johns Hopkins University, their School of Public Health a few years ago did a study, and they were looking at all the various mental health diagnoses that one might receive, all the depressions, anxieties, personality disorders, and so on. And they were looking at which one has the most negative social loading, the most negative stigma. No big surprise here, but substance use disorders, which is the term now used for addiction, so at the very bottom of the barrel. And so you've got that kind of judgment that is going on, at least in the US society, coupled with what just came out this year from Washington, which is that 46.3 million Americans over the age of 12, they use 12 as the cutoff, over the age of 12 are currently addicted to substances. 46.3 million Americans, which means that we're all subject to stigma, either receiving stigma and or being those that stigmatize. But let me add another statistic just to throw this in there. 90% of Americans endorse that they have at least one behavioral addiction right now, which would be all of the non-substance addictions. In fact, I've heard some people say about the 10% that didn't say they had it is that they either were lying or maybe just didn't understand the question. Which is to say that it's universal. And this is, Colette, this is why I'm so enthused to meet you, is that it helps to provide the image I use. We're all in the soup together with this.
Yeah.
As you said, Roger, the heart of any religious or wisdom tradition, including Buddhism, is that to be human is to be subject to being enslaved, which is just the root understanding of addiction. Addictus in Latin means to be enslaved or to be a bondservant. Well, that's what we're all up against. So the first step would be to humanize our conversation like we are right now. And this is why I'm so delighted, Colette, for you to be out. I'm a third of the way. I'm in my 11th year of sobriety. So congratulations. You got sober the year my daughter was born, so that'll be an easy mnemonic for me. But whether it's 37 years or 11 years or 37 minutes, it doesn't really matter. We're all in this together. And so at the very least, can we connect on that? You know, Colette, you said we're disconnected. Can we at least connect on the fact that we're human beings, that they're all subject to, whether it's substance addictions or behavioral addictions? I even think of attitudinal addictions, like you said, Colette. Yeah. An attitude such as my identity, I am a victim, therefore I am. That would be an attitude that doesn't serve, and it's quite possible to get quite attached to that, and that attachment itself could become the source of my suffering. So let's all just let down the walls that separate us from addicts, from what do they call it? I hear this term sometimes in treatment centers, so-called normies. I'd like to know what a normie is.
I don't know any.
What's it?
Yeah, if you find one, let us know, Bob.
I think that
doesn't qualify.
But there's an important point here under this, Bob. I mean, we're all laughing about this, but the implication is really important, that our normal human condition is one of psychological dis-ease of various kinds, both craving and aversion, and significantly major degrees of psychological immaturity. That the research now is crystal clear that the human potential contains the possibility of maturing way beyond what we think of the ceiling of possibilities. And so what we take to be normality is looking more and more like a collective form of unrecognized developmental arrest, in which we are all addicted to varying degrees and subtleties. We're all fearful of various things. We are so much less than we can be, but it takes an awful lot of work to get beyond that. And you two have done that kind of work, and I think have some very important pointers for us all.
Thank you. Beautifully said, Roger.
I mean, I do think that we are 100% all. We can include everybody, but I really do think that the result of active addiction is disconnection. When we need each other, we then can it's a lot easier for us to other people when our whatever the source of our addiction creates this, closed door, your life is suction cupped onto the end of your nose. You don't have space for anyone else. So there really is a purpose to us to discuss recovery. I don't like to just throw it away to say, oh, everybody's addicted, but what about recovery? What does that look like? I know not everybody seeks a higher power. For example, if you're a Buddhist, you have a different view of spirituality or life. You have your it's that there is something greater than myself and my pain and my story and my limitations, that there's something greater for me, but for humanity. So for those people whose addictions create that much dissonance and disconnection, how do we offer them, outside of an intellectual discourse on addiction and how we're all in this together, like what is it we could offer them as some type of solace? Because I know when I was in active addiction, I didn't think anybody would ever understand me or know my pain or care. I had such low self-worth. I couldn't connect because I was too afraid to. There were so many things around this that now, because you asked again, we set this in the very beginning of this conversation about when we look at things universally, our civilization at this moment, how does it recover from itself? And what do we offer?
I've sometimes asked groups that I lead, what is it that we're recovering? And it's not meant to be a trick question. I don't really ask trick questions. It's like, and it really opens up into some thoughtful responses at every possible level. One of the shorthands that I've used that cuts across all traditions is I say, we're here to recover our original face before we were born. Just to start with that as a metaphor. And then what might that look like for each individual? I fully agree with you, Colette, is that I think it's important to have a clear understanding of addiction, body, mind, and spirit, for sure. I think that that's a start, but I don't believe that top-down information is nearly adequate for the transformation that's required. You know that you wouldn't have made it for 37 years, or I for 11 years, were it just for intellectual information. In fact, if it was for just intellectual information, I wouldn't have gotten addicted. I would have just read all the books. Fine, right?
Exactly.
Obviously need something else. John, you've been a huge inspiration for this, and you too, Roger. Roger, I told Roger that last night I had a dream of him, and in the dream, Roger, you were telling me about therapeutic life changes. Is that right, Roger?
That's right. TLCs.
It was you were telling me about TLCs in the dream, literally. That
Roger, so clear, even in dreams. That's so awesome.
Right now it was very clear in the dreams. That, in concert with the work that you've done, John, your work on integral recovery practice, which would just be holistic recovery practice with a very clear map, that's learning from the bottom up. It's practicing the things that you've written about, Roger. John, what you've written about, and Colette, I presume in all the work that you do, is that we introduce the individuals that we work with. Most, if not all of them, are suffering from various forms of attachment and aversion. We teach them practices that provide resource really across the entire spectrum. That's so much of my work as a recovery coach. Some of it is helping to reduce stress, trauma, and my background in psychology helps me to do that. But a good bit of it is to introduce resources that become part of one's daily menu, daily nourishment.
Yeah, and I wanted to say something. A student of mine taught me this one time. We had a group of people, and somebody was saying, well, we're all addicted, like I'm addicted to football, or stuff like that. And this guy was really smart. He was a 4 in the Enneagram, but he got really upset. And he said, no, man, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. And I had happened to sit with this young man when he came off. He was drinking, he's a small guy, 2 bottles of vodka, liters or quarts a day. tons of heroin, all kinds of pills, smoking, chain smoking, all this stuff in one little body, and he came to me, he was at death's door, and I sat through this thing. And I was like, about 12 hours into this, it's like, I wouldn't wish this on Adolf Hitler. This is so vicious. Just going psychotic and hallucinating and throwing up and shitting himself and just all of this stuff on and on and on. And it was, yeah, I could get it. There's something about, quitting cigarettes is really hard. And that same student told me, he says, heroin was bad to quit. Cigarettes are worse. It's not easy to quit cigarettes. Some people never do, and it will kill you. However, besides people not liking the way you smell or you having to go outside, it's not like one of these substance addictions that changes your behavior radically in such a way that you can't conduct your life anymore. You can't be a father or, a mother or have a job that's not involved in stealing or pushing or something like that. It's just this change of personality from the person that you were before into something that is much, much lower on the evolutionary scale, and someone, a functioning psychopath, basically, where nothing matters anymore except the substance. And that includes selling your own body, doing whatever. The stories I'm sure we've heard in our work over the years it's just shocking. So, I just want to say that particular type of addiction is life-threatening, and some of the drugs that are out now, the fentanyl and the amphetamines, and I see people down in this southern Utah where I live, where I am right now, and it's a very Mormon culture, cowboys, good straight shooting folks. I love these folks down here, but you'll see these people with scabs all over. They're all skinny and their teeth are coming out, and and they're just, can I help you, sir? They're I guess they're kind to do their job, but they're very they're on the road to self-destruction, and it's not much longer left. And it's just want to say that kind of addiction, not to discount the other stuff, but it's
there are levels. I think that we acknowledge that there are levels, and like you said about, they can no longer be fathers or hold jobs that don't include crime, or they, that we're talking about having no self-respect and doing things that you would never do in your right mind. But also you stop being functioning in society. And if we're going to have functioning society, that means if you go back to tribal society, everybody had a role, everybody needed each other, or the tribe wouldn't survive. The thing that you would to be sent away was the worst possible punishment, because you couldn't survive, right? So we now have a scenario in our society where, and I see it again, I'm going back to the addiction to the phones, right? The addiction to the devices, where we're not looking at each other anymore. We're just looking in the box, right? Where, how, to me, that's not like shooting heroin, and that's not like smoking crack or any of those things. You're not going to behave in such a way, but you are cut off from one another at that point. These are not real, these are fake connections to a great degree. So we need to, I found anyway, go back to my recovery came when I found true community, where we had a common connection and a common purpose, right? Which was to stay clean and sober and help the next addict to achieve sobriety. So in some ways, how could we apply that to society at large right now? Like, what is there? Do you know what I mean? Like, where is community? And that's the part that I'm looking at now, going, because I've been down the darkest hole, and I'm looking at that going, that may look subtle, but it's not.
Yeah. There was a study done some years ago at Harvard on what makes self-help support groups in recovery, like the 12-step support groups, what makes them effective. And since it was at Harvard, it was done by the School of Psychology, they weren't going to be looking at the concept of higher power. They would give that to the School of Theology out of respect. But what they found were two things, and they're both implied, I think, Colette, in what you're saying, and also what may be missing on a really kind of global level. The first thing was the term they used was universality. And that is the fact that I can be in a group with you and we speak the same language. And so there's a we're connected universally that way. And I might add that there's no judgment because we're in that together. So that was one, universality. But the second one is really, you just stated it, the second healing factor of self-help support groups was what they called altruism. And it's really what we're talking about. It's what you just said. It's helping another person out of their own suffering, out of their own enslavement to addiction. And so some way to be connected in a way that our goal is to contribute. Our goal is to give back. Our goal is to pay forward. We're wired as human beings to be pro-social. We're wired to connect. I love that video. You've seen it by Johan Hari, the one that's gone viral on addiction. The last words of it have just become iconic. He says, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And there it is right there.
100%.
Yeah.
100%, which is why that's what I talked about right away. It is about the connection and how we need that now more than ever. And so, where do we start that? So, in my community, for example, we have, I have a membership and I have a school, etc. I have lots of different places where people come. And the most important thing, as I tell everybody when they walk in the room, especially in my training programs, is you're not broken. Like, let's start there. Because the minute we start seeing ourselves somehow as less than, we're not going to be in connection to others. We're going to find a way just in case we get exposed. So it's that we come in and say, the one thing that we share in common is the desire to transform. That's all. The rest of it's superfluous. What you do for a living is not important. So where it's kind of like also coming out of a strong addiction, you realize what is really important in terms of your identity is not the things that we're being told are important, right?
And one of the things about addiction is just it's taking, stealing, betraying, all of this stuff, violence, but recovery and basic spirituality and humanity 101 is about service. So I've been to a lot of meetings in my life, taking people to their first meetings, getting there. Yeah, I've worked the steps myself, but we would get there early. Our local meeting here, a very, very loving meeting. And so I said, okay, guys, now we're gonna set up the chairs. Okay. We're going to start making really bad coffee because these guys like bad coffee. I'm not sure why, but you've got a couple of weeks sober, but we're going to start giving and serving the group already, and then you get, people, well, I didn't need to go to a meeting, I've been in the meetings. I said, well, maybe there's somebody that needs you to listen to them.
Yeah.
You ever think of that? Just be there. And I noticed there's a shift when it really starts to kick in. And it's not just you're doing it to stay out of jail or you're doing it because your parents are going to cut you off or whatever. It's like this idea of giving back in service and compassion starts to blossom. And the huge false addictive self gets a little smaller. And the suppressed, insulted, denigrated true self begins, and what you want to do in the addiction later stages, obviously the addictive personality is completely different and that's one of the signs of true addiction. There's this massive personality change, things you would never do in ways you'd never behave, and begins to shrink a bit. And then, you get there, it's about 50-50. And if you continue in the process and you deepen your spiritual connection and deepen your practice and realize that, there, but for the grace of God, one day at a time, all of these essential things that 12 steps have brought into the world, it grows bigger, but the addict self is still always there. Some remnant, some weakened part. And sometimes you might just ask, well, what do you want me to do in this situation? get fucked up, you know. It's like it's always there. And
Let's eat that cake.
yeah, to let you know that it's still there, and also to keep us, our compassion for others, and not like, hey, I'm fixed, I got mine. It's not like that at all. That it can't be that way. It has to be service and humility and love, and all of a sudden you have a meaning in your life. You're part of a community that's helping each other day by day. And these people, I don't have a vehicle. I lost my car and everything, man. Boom, they're there. They pick you up. I mean, it's truly, it's not talked about enough, maybe, but it's truly an amazing thing to watch and be a part of.
And it's about belonging. That's the other thing. I think that's part of, a friend of mine just wrote a book on loneliness, which I thought was brilliant. She talked about all this, how our culture, really fosters loneliness, even though it appears that we're more connected on our machines, etc. But one thing that I know is that the sense of belonging is an experience. It's not a theory. You can't talk or think your way into belonging. You have to show up, right? It's a continuum. It's an evolutionary process that happens when you join one of those groups, or you get into a community where you're safe. You feel like you can be yourself. You're not going to get judged for the one thing that you think you're the most ashamed of, which is, of course, what happens in meetings like NA or AA or CA or wherever the A is. It's, or any kind of recovery group. So there really is a sense that the altruism is not just the sense that we want to give, because addiction is a very self-centered, selfish, but it's also that I am altruistic, but that makes me feel like I belong. Like that, the result of the altruism is like, I want to come back and be there again. And I think for me, I was never a group joiner. I would rather poke myself in the eye than join a group. Okay. It's like, forget it. But I remember here I am, in this group of misfits in this women's treatment center. And I'm like, at the end of it, I didn't want to go home. I was like, oh my God, I love these women. I don't want to leave. Like, there was the first true, real, raw, honest. So the honesty too, and the willingness to be true to what is true to you at the time, is also very compelling, very compelling.
Well, we are back. We took a break, and I just want to say I was thinking during the break is how happy I am. Feels so good to be here with you people talking about this. It's like anyway, it's really touched my heart, and I'm thinking about all the the work I did over the years, and the successes and the people we lost, and
Yep.
So let's just keep this. You were starting to talk, but it was during the break.
And you wanted me to be quiet. So.
Yeah, I just want to keep the juju in, but now you can let it go. So
one of the things that I was thinking about that I've noticed a trend is to lump everything. Our use of language has changed. Example, the concept of trauma. So two of my favorite trauma teachers are Thomas Hübl and Gabor Mate. So they have, I love what they have to say about it. But a lot of people don't read, right? And they don't study these guys. And, I think that we all have trauma. Well, there are varying degrees of trauma. Trauma is the firefighter that went in and saw 4 charred bodies, in a fire. That's trauma. Trauma is, my mom was, my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, was killed my mother was a Holocaust survivor, my grandfather was killed in Dachau. That's trauma to me, right? So the fact that some guy ghosted you is not trauma, on an email. To me, I find that it's an overused and underexplained term that everybody lumps everything in. And same with addiction. I think, we're all addicts. And I'm not saying that anything about what you said, Robert, because I think what you said came from a place of desire for compassion and connection. But it's when we lump everything into the same barrel, it dilutes the truth of the variations of a person's experience. and their need or to reconnect to source again, or however you do that, whether it's, you know, through the noble truths, whether it's with a higher power, I don't care how it is. You can be an atheist. We had the most fun room for me to sit in my 12-step program was the atheist room, even though I love spirit, universe, but I don't have any religious context for that at all. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I think it's just important right now that I don't know, maybe is it important, or am I just making a statement of an observation? And how do we turn this into something that's helpful for other people without losing the entire point?
Well, I think you're making a very important point, Colette, and that is that there's a process of, first off, let's step back and acknowledge the psychologization of our culture. We're a very psychological culture, and we tend to think in ways which previous generations didn't, in psychological terms. Part of that is what is technically called diagnostic creep, that these technical diagnoses, usually for very severe disorders such as major depression or the kind of trauma you're talking to, the absolute trauma, the horror of war or rape or assault, etc. Those creep into the culture and become used in part ways. Oh, I'm depressed. Well, probably if you really knew what depression was like, you wouldn't say that. I'm traumatized. Well, you had a bad day, etc. And you suffered, yes. But I think you're pointing to a very important distinction, Colette, and it is important to acknowledge the degrees of these things.
Yeah, there's no nuance right now.
Yeah.
I have a thought response. I feel like it's the flip side of an earlier point I was making, and you nailed it, Colette. You're absolutely right. If the wish is to reduce the distinctions that are made, I think you used the word othering, then I'm all for looking at how that we're all in the soup together, to use my own phrase for this. I think there's value to that. The shadow side of the limitation of that is exactly what we're talking about. And I'll talk personally for a second. I taught, I went to graduate school in psychology. I taught in a graduate school in psychology for years. And the statistic, and I was seeing clients as a licensed clinical psychologist. The statistic is something like this, is up to 50% of clients that see an outpatient therapist are currently clinically addicted to substance. That's an enormous statistic, which matches my experience. So I was dealing clinically with addiction, and Colette, I thought I understood it. I really did. My fate was that I got addicted in midlife, and boy, was that a game changer for me and a lesson in humility, because it's really not okay to say I'm addicted to chocolate and assume that's the same as what it's like to be addicted to methamphetamine. They are not the same. And so having said that, I had a huge discovery. And John, you've been with me through this, the aftermath of the discovery, right back to the very beginnings of my recovery, is that I realized that I didn't know, all the books I had read, all the clients I had seen, I was never judgmental by nature. For that, I'm grateful. But in terms of being able to really empathize with what it's like to lose control of your life in every regard that really matters, I didn't know that till I knew that. And that's really the case now, is that so I really want to acknowledge if both can be true, kind of like light as a wave and a particle. There's a way that we're all addicted. If you go up the road to UCLA and look at the brain of somebody who's in the midst of a video game addiction and compare that with addicted to methamphetamine, you literally cannot tell the difference looking at their brain scans, which one is on video games and which one's on meth. You can't tell by looking at them. It's the very same systems. Having said that, there's no comparison of video game addiction to methamphetamine in terms of the stimulation of the dopamine receptors, for example. It's just off the charts. And so I might have been addicted to this or that attitude, but until I got addicted to alcohol, cocaine, and other drugs, I had no concept of what it's like to have the top of your head blown off and how that can ruin your life. And so I really want to acknowledge that as well. It's like equal parts compassion. Let's not other those that are in rank addiction like I was, on the one hand. On the other hand, humility. Let's not assume that because we've been addicted to chocolate or exercise that we know what it's like to be addicted to heroin, because we don't.
But I think you made a really good point about our society being a society of addiction, is what it sounds like. So we say this and that is true. This is true that everybody has addictive tendencies, but what is also true is the degrees in which we become disconnected from one another, from our higher power, if you believe in that, from our humanity, which is what is robbed of us. And we end up in jails, institutions, or dead, any kind of really serious addiction. Even food addiction, is extremely harmful. And I was also addicted to cigarettes, John. They were harder to quit than Coke.
Yeah.
But it's really, I think it's on our lips and it's in our discussions because of the fallout from it and the need for healing, the need for compassion for one another as opposed to the othering, right? What you said, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is connection, right? And I think that if we are going to say universally that we are addicts or in some way, then how do we get more connection when part of what we're addicted to too is the othering, right? Is the ism of the, that the kind of polarization. And I live in Canada, so it's not as rampantly obvious up here than it is in the US. Like with you guys, your politics are very, you guys are super extreme. Well, I love America. I'm there often. And so I've lived there for many years and now I've lived back in Canada. But, it doesn't matter where you are. It's like, look around at the society, say you find out what it needs by looking at how it suffers.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, would you guys, I'll just put this up, but with the work that you've done with individuals and the groups you've been a member and the people, it seems, in my experience, it seems that our, my beloved addicts and alcoholics and, late stage, that severe trauma, real deal stuff is often part of the whole syndrome. And so to get sober, a lifetime plan without dealing with that underlying or unconscious, albeit controlling trauma is not, the odds go way down being able to keep it together. So what do you guys think about that?
Okay, I'm gonna start talking here because the whole point of sobriety is not to be dry. The whole point of sobriety is to deal with those things. You take away the medicine, which was medicine in the beginning, which then became the poison. But the whole reason you do it is to escape yourself and to escape connection. So when you come back and you are raw and you have to, if you follow a 12-step program, you have to look at yourself with clarity and you make amends when you see it. And you keep on doing the inventory, like what is my part in this, etc., without blame or shame in the game. So if you don't deal with those original traumas, etc., you're going to continue to be triggered and you're likely going to continue to have more and more similar things, but they get less and less the harder, the more. Now I don't want to say harder, the more you actually work this through, right? So I think you get sober, then you go get help.
Yeah. What do you think? What's your perception of that?
What's that?
Just about, as far as trauma being part and parcel of the whole addictive process. Severe stuff.
A thought comes to mind, the ACE studies that were so pivotal in addiction research back in the 90s were looking at adverse childhood experiences. And Roger, these studies too. They were looking at the correlations between childhood trauma, physical abuse, neglect, emotional sexual abuse, parental drug abuse, incarceration, all these categories. They were looking at medical markers. They were looking at how does this predict vulnerability to cardiopulmonary difficulties, cancer, diabetes, and so on. And they threw addiction into the mix. And what they discovered is that to have, and it's a linear correlation, the more trauma you've experienced, the more vulnerable you are to addiction, to the order of 5 or 10 times the normal level of risk involved. So they asked, well, what's going on with that? And what they discovered is that to be exposed to severe developmental trauma is to be in adulthood walking around with a baseline cortisol and adrenaline level, the stress hormones. It's going to be 5 or 10 times normal. I think of this thing as walking down the sidewalk. Somebody who didn't grow up in my background, or Colette, I'm going to infer from what you said, your background, they're walking around and their baseline stress level might be a 1, whereas mine is a 10.
Yeah.
As I've mentioned before, I used to have a client who was a RN, a nurse, and she said, Bob, nobody can barbecue on their own adrenaline. And I've never forgotten that, is that you literally can't, it's not sustainable to walk around with that kind of elevation in baseline stress level. And so the way this goes then from the ACE studies is that not everybody that's been traumatized becomes clinically addicted, but virtually 100% of those that are clinically addicted were traumatized. And you get exceptions, like in a room of 25 people, I'll discuss these results. And there'll be one person that said, Bob, I grew up in a totally facilitative home environment, had good friends, good support, believed in God and all of that. And that happens. People you just fall in with the wrong crowd, go to the wrong party, whatever like that. That is so radically the exception, it proves the rule. So the rule is that trauma feeds directly into addiction. And out of a group of addicts, very few would not have experienced that, which gets back to Colette's point, which is that if we don't do shadow work in whatever form, my background as a psychologist is that I dig deep into personal trauma, for example, current relationships that may be traumatizing, etc., is that and also shame. Shame. You dig into the sources of shadow, and that's what you work on to get free of that. So, and we all have different methodologies for doing that. I don't see how anybody can sustain. I think you can get sober, but I don't think you can sustain sobriety without doing that deep digging down into the shadow and getting that cleared up. So I would agree with you, Colette, that it's absolutely required. Yeah.
Yeah. Totally.
That
Otherwise, you're just dry. You're a dry drunk.
That really is the definition of one in action, isn't it? Is that I can stop drinking for right now. What I can't do is sustain it. And what I'm doing is just waiting till I pop. Freud had this hydraulic model, the idea that the pressure builds and builds and builds until it pops, and then you have relapse. And so it is possible to stop drinking or drugging. It's not possible to sustain that without doing the shadow work, as far as I'm concerned. If it involves virtually 100% of those that are in an addicted population, there's going to have to be some technology, some methodology for dealing with that. And every therapeutic persuasion has a different way of doing that. But it's right in the heart of the work you do, Colette. I'm sure of it, and you can bet your bottom dollar it is in the work that I do. And it's also, speaking of which, let's just talk honestly, my own work. I've been in therapy because I've been a psychologist my whole life since birth. I've been in therapy all these years, and there were new levels of therapy that I needed to do in terms of digging into shadow. So it wasn't that I was unworked. I just had so much more to do. And I realized, I'll talk very specifically. I had so much shame that came up around the losses connected to my own addiction. The losses were just cataclysmic, personally and professionally for me. I realized early on that if I don't find tools to deal with this element of the shadow, that is shame, I will die. And that wasn't melodrama, that was the reality. I have got to find ways to deal with this. And so it was like you say, John, when you're stressed out, you don't meditate less, you meditate more. When I discovered what I was up against, I didn't do less therapy, I did more therapy in every possible modality imaginable, psychologically and spiritually. It was all required if I was going to survive this.
I think you touched on that. Shame is such a crucial part of recovery. You know, you're ashamed that you don't have control. We live in a society where, you know, all the different isms are about controlling yourself, controlling other people, controlling where you are in the hierarchy of the people, you know, but when it comes to like that sense of I don't have control and I have destroyed these things, or even, you know, when you're molested or you've been raped, you've lost control you lost the ability to choose. There's shame there. There's shame one of the first books I read in recovery, because it was written at, back in the early 80s, was Healing the Shame That Binds, right? That was such a crucial turning point. I joined a group that went through the book. It was so powerful and profound, that how shame really, really runs the show,
Yeah.
And there's two things you can do with this trauma that I found. Either you can turn the shame on yourself and self-destruct, or you can turn it on others and just destroy it and hurt and control and work it out that way. So either way, and sometimes it's a mixture of both. But you can't keep that thing in the basement without. And for alcoholics and addicts, it's quite essential. And I think probably in traditional, it's not, doesn't talk about it in the 12 steps, but going to groups and talking about it and having other people, witness your pain and hurt and realize that all these other, brothers and sisters with you have been through other stuff like that has helped. And I think I think it's helpful to remember. I intellectually get it. Oh, I've been traumatized. That's why I can't remember my childhood. That's what happened there. And that's not bad. That's a step in the right direction, but it ain't enough. So,
yeah.
I feel like Roger pointed to this earlier, Roger, when you cited the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, and there'd be different languaging of this across the various traditions. But if you think about it just functionally, how it goes, shame has led me to contract, and just what you said, John, to turn it on myself or to turn it towards others. And so when you get in the 12-step programs and there's this idea of surrendering to a higher power, that's like my worst nightmare. I'm going to surrender. Really what I'm trying to do is protect. And so whether it's in Buddhism or the 12-step program or any other wisdom tradition worth its salt, what's required is to do the very worst thing imaginable, which is to let go of what I've done to protect myself. In fact, I look at my own addictive behaviors as survival strategies. So you're asking for me to let go of my survival strategies, even if they've been long-term dysfunctional. They served at some point. They're well, the psychic grooves are deep, and I'm being asked to let go of that. And so it really requires being in a supportive matrix, whether it be a group or in a therapeutic relationship, where over time, very gradually, I can begin to let down the barriers that I've had that have kept me contracted or constricted, let those down, and eventually let go into, I want to say, let go of self. And again, whether it's in Buddhism or Christianity or any other religious tradition, and it certainly is right at the heart of the 12-step movement, is to let go, to really surrender. The Serenity Prayer is all about that. To be able to let go of that which I can't control, and tell that to somebody in the midst of addiction, or tell that to somebody who's been severely traumatized, that the goal of their work is to let go, and they'll tell you you're crazy. It doesn't mean it's not true. It just means it's really difficult, really challenging.
Yeah, and let me say something about shame that I found is that shame is not guilt, right? If you do something bad and you feel guilty about it, well, that's good. That's the universe of your soul saying, you got to fix this. You got to try to do something to bring this back into balance. But shame is not that I did something bad, but I am bad. My essence is bad and broken and awful. And the horrible thing is, a child might have been abused or abused as a child, sexually, violently, all these different things. And they take it in themselves. And I'm bad because what was done to me. It's like, that's a vicious twist. But that's how it seems to play out. And then you go, well, I'm bad. I'm not worth it. So why not just drink myself to death? It doesn't matter. I don't matter. And there it is.
Shame, it's a freeze response in the brain. And so it shuts us down. It's like a deer in the headlights. And so one reason that I drank and did drugs was to feel alive again, because I felt dead inside. I had so much shame I'd inherited, as my parents had inherited. You can just take it all the way back to Adam and Eve. Okay, so there was that. So one way to be enlivened was to get high, and I understand that. On the other hand, there's a way that the shame can also stir such fear and anxiety that I needed some way to numb out from it. And so I was kind of going both ways. I was numbing out with my addictions, and I was also getting high, getting enlivened. And you get caught in this loop of getting high, numbing out, getting high, numbing out. And I was lost in that and never did what you're talking about, Colette. Never really thought about what would it be like to let go of this particular game and begin to connect with trustworthy people. What I learned early on, and I see this a lot in the work I do, is that individuals who've been traumatized, it's typically in the context of relationship. So why would you go to relationship as resource if that's been the source of trauma? So let's just stick with substance. Let's stick up here because this is safe. So it really requires, Jung calls it the opus contra naturam. It's the work against nature. You have to go against what your natural instincts are, which is, let me not trust people. You have to begin to be willing to open up to other individuals and to your higher power.
And I think that's why too, that, I mean, the one of the most important things that I learned in early recovery was to live in 24-hour compartments, because you can do that in a day, right? You can allow a little bit more in a day. If you think, oh, it's always going to, I will always be vulnerable, you're less likely. I don't stay sober for the rest of my life. I've just happened to stay sober a day at a time for a long time.
Really impressive.
It's like, it's just working the 12 steps and having therapists and coaches. You know, when I need it and I bump up against something, I go get help. So it's that sense of, okay, what do I need to do? Who do I need to become? And how do I let this go? Again, it's always about surrender. Always, always, always about surrender. And I've never let go of anything that didn't have my claw marks all over it. So, you know, it's like, and I'm like, even though I know, hey, surrender is the thing. It's like, no, I'm like, oh God, here we go again. And you kind of get to a point where you learn to be the observer, the witness, you know, and realize, oh, here this part of me goes again, and the machinations of fear or anxiety, whatever, you know, and I do think though, too, I think all of us, since we've been through such a prolonged state of uncertainty on a global level, I think that's also become part of why we're seeing more and more of the kind of addictive behavior and bad behavior basically everywhere, because that was a collective trauma. I think that we could say that was something we all shared. We all shared fear. We all shared losses, etc. You know, and now it doesn't look like there's much relief.
Yeah.
So,
There's been a fair bit of research just in the last few years since COVID on trying to understand the radical increase in addiction and substance use disorders. It's really radical. Also a radical increase in suicides. And so these are really highly correlated. And they've attributed them to two primary sources, and both of them you've named, Colette. One is the disconnection that comes owing to the pandemic of just quarantine. I mean, just, you know, so now where there's no connection. And the second is related, and you also mentioned this too, in psychology, one of the ironclad correlations is between cognitive ambiguity, not knowing what's going to happen, and anxiety. The one goes up with the other. And can you think of a time of more cognitive ambiguity, not knowing what the heck happened year after year after year during COVID? And so it's no surprise then that we resort to all kinds of addictive means. And also what you said, just being bad, doing bad things, is like it evokes depression, you know? Yeah.
Look at people on airplanes right now too. Like I'm watching like people with such short fuses. It's the manners, right? What are the new manners? Right? Like what happened to manners? We don't have, that's also been interesting to see that dissolve.
I think manners are a luxury of the frontal cortex. If I can just go brain for just a second. The frontal cortex is the seat of our compassion and our communication and our judgment in terms of looking at long-term consequences. The more stressed I am, by definition, the less real estate I have in my frontal cortex, the more driven I am by the emotional center of the brain, typically the amygdala. And at some point, I just become kind of a midbrain stump, and you don't want to be around me, you know. And I think we're in that.
I love that. That's funny.
Yeah.
Midbrain stump.
I'm wondering to what extent these things you've been talking about, Bob, play into the fact that it seems like, to a large degree, we haven't yet reestablished the degree of social connectivity after COVID. I have that feeling myself. I'm beginning to make conscious effort to rebuild and strengthen and enrich networks, because I feel like it just hasn't recovered. And I hear this from a lot of people, and I also hear that people have become more introspective or less available. So I'm intrigued by what you're saying, Bob, about the shifts that have happened and the explosion of suicide and addiction.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, Roger, that you're asking. I'm not unaware. I'm 68 years old, Colette. So I'm very aware moving into the fall that there's at least one or two new strands of COVID against which I haven't been vaccinated yet. And I've been vaccinated along the way. And I did get COVID, but I was spared the worst of it owing to vaccinations and medications that were available. So there's that. There's the information that we're not out of COVID. In fact, I just read in the New York Times this weekend that across the United States, including in California, I presume this is the case in Canada, there are increasing cases once against the COVID. And for people my age, I think 68 is the cutoff. So I think you're good, Colette. But at my age, I need to be very aware of the risk factor. And so there's that. And then back to your point, Roger, is that I think that fear does isolate us. Not always. So sometimes you can get kind of group think that is kind of scary. You can get people, moving into a group. You're talking about your grandfather dying in Dachau. Think of what happened post World War I in Germany in terms of the mentality of fear and loss and impoverishment and what catalyzed there around Hitler and Nazism. So I'm on the lookout for that. I'm not unaware of that here in the United States, that there's a tendency to want to kind of clump together, but it's clumping together in a very much ethnocentric way. It's us against them. So I think fear can make us do that. Having said that, I think individually, it does isolate us. I think fear, we have to go against that to reach out. And it's been your mantra. It's what you've been singing today, Colette, is our need for connection. I totally support you in that. And it requires a lot of courage to do that, to risk when I'm fearful and want to protect myself or my family or my people, to reach out and to connect, to include. It's moving against that. I think it's required, and it really is under duress right now. John, you've been a champion and so involved in raising awareness around Ukraine and what's going on right now in that particular location. It's just heartbreaking to anybody that has a conscience, and that's happening all over the world right now. And so it's understandable that we begin to isolate and or turn against, and in that become much more vulnerable to addictive behaviors. Our good friend, John's and my good friend, Guy Duplessis, has written a number of articles on what he calls ideology addiction. There's one for you to think. Ideology.
That's cool.
And you think about how easy it is to resort to that. Now I'm going to be addicted to my belief system.
Right.
And if you don't agree with my belief system, I'm going to kill you for the sake of whatever the higher power of my belief system is. That's scary shit.
And also you become part of an inner group. The people that get it, there's a whole group thing to this ideology. It's you wear your MAGA hat. Let's just bring that one out. It's so obvious, the elephant that's walking by in the room. It's something about being a part of that. You've got other people and they get it, and you have the secret stuff that comes from Q and the QAnon thing and secret messages and everything. So there's a sense of deep belonging, and to leave that, even maybe your mind is turning, maybe not so, but it's like, leave this, then what do I do? I'm just
there you go.
I'm just alone in the world again.
Yeah.
I loved Eric Hoffer's book all those years ago. He was the longshoreman philosopher, and he wrote The True Believer, and it was a psychology of mass movements. And he wrote it back in the 50s, I believe it was. It's just a little short book. It really had an impact on me, but that's what we are. We're all vulnerable to that right now. I love one of the things we're doing today, which is stepping back from the canvas and looking at addiction writ large, looking at it collectively. It's really easy to blame or indict some individual for being addicted. Now, aren't they a loser, in terms of the kinds of attributions are made? But if we step back and look at that, we're all vulnerable to these cultural and global forces right now, and that addiction could be understood in relationship to the collective as much as to any individual story, including individual trauma. Collectively, globally, we're in a state of trauma right now.
Boy. And boy, howdy, as they say out west, and certainly are. I wanted to ask you guys, and of course, Roger, you can join in on this, but deep transformation, that's the name of the podcast. So, and in the 12 steps, the spiritual part is essential. It started happening when Bill, had this experience of light when he was in the mental hospital because of his addiction. And that has been carried down through generations and of 12 steppers, if you will. And when I first started, I worked as a counselor / therapist in a treatment center in Oakland called Thunder Road. I hope it's still there. It was a good one. It was for teenagers, for young people. And, we worked so hard, we got really burnt out. That was a hard part of it. But either you had a degree or you were in recovery yourself. They hired both kind of people. And I was the former. And and I liked, I've been, as I said, I've been hunted by God since, I was very young. And I liked working in a place where you could, use the G word, if you will,
Yeah.
and you wouldn't be escorted out of the building, so it's like, oh, that's good. But I think if recovery is to last, and it's not just being dry, and especially when, you're dealing with all these heavy issues, more of trauma, in many more cases than not, that that spiritual aspect of the program has to, get just beyond the initial thing, pray, God, thank you for keeping me sober today and help me do it tomorrow in the morning. I mean, that's all good. There's nothing wrong with that, but it has to go deeper than that. And your friend and our recent guest, James Finley, is a beautiful example of deep spiritual connection and being a brilliant psychologist and bringing those two together. And ultimately, I think it feels that the deep kind of healing cannot happen without the transformational spiritual practice. So I would ask you guys, it's like, how do you keep it going? What is your practice and how has it changed since? And I know you were a scholar of a Christian, a lot of stuff in the university, and you had a lot of book learning in religion, Bob. You're really good at that. But then, you fell on your face and everything, and you had to come out of it. And all of a sudden it wasn't a scholarly issue anymore. It was very personal. So how has it changed for you guys since the first day you got sober and realized I can't do this anymore? And how has it progressed over the years? And what, from that experience, what wisdom can you, share with the rest of us about how to keep that connection strong to ground of being, God, spirit, however you want to say it?
Go ahead, Colette. Why don't you start? I'm happy to respond, but I'd love to hear from you. This is so much your front yard and the work you do. Yeah.
Okay. I was really excited to listen to you, but okay, I'll just throw myself in there. Okay, so I do pretty much what I did right from the beginning. But the difference being is that I change. So, the transformational journey for me is about developing a conscious contact to a higher power, that I go from the word God to universe to spirit to field to source. I don't care what I name it. It doesn't mean there's no dogma attached to it. There is this great intelligence that when I align with it, then I am in coherence with the world. I'm aligned with the highest good. And I know that oftentimes what I think is best for me is not true. So I surrender to that greater truth. And do no harm is a huge one for me. Is like, is this am I harming in any way? And if I'm unaware of it, how do I become aware of it so I don't do it again, right? Doing a continuous inventory, looking at where am I at right now? What, how could I have done this better without being perfectionistic, just about how awake and aware I am. And I, outside of the 12 steps, I do therapy. I do EMDR because I've had like stuff that has lived inside my nervous system. I'm 65 years old, and only 2 years ago, I started looking back at the stuff that happened to me when I was 19 that still comes up in the behavior that I have. It's not about what it outside does to me. It's that, oh, this part of me is really active and I can't think my way out of this. And it's creating problems for me. It's creating a dissonance for me with other people or with the world, etc. And for me also, I've, to stay on track, connecting to my higher power, connecting to my recovery, I'm really clear now that boundaries, people pleasing, wearing the world as a loose garment, and not trying to control things. My mantra, my husband loves this mantra: I am not in control. I am not large and in charge. Who's large and in charge? Not me. So, right. And then to have a sense of humor, to cultivate humor, but it's a dance. It's a dance. Like, I want certain things. I want to be creative. I want results, and that, et cetera, et cetera. And then, okay, I got to surrender it too. It's like both and. The thing that gets me into trouble is when I get overwhelmed with the amount of information that I see, and I feel like somehow almost apathetic because I can't do anything or enough or whatever, and then the anxiety. So I still have to work on that. But again, I could just give you a list of all my isms that I have to work on. But it's a commitment on a daily basis to inner peace, really, letting those hungry ghosts go, or, recognizing that, that the truth and the honesty and the rigorous honesty that I have to practice is all about feeling at peace and not wanting anything. I think that's the other thing. It's like letting go that wanting. And to me, I didn't even say the most important thing. Everything I do is service. Like when I say that, I'm not like the perfect, but I am most happy when I know I'm in. That's what I did today before we talked. I prayed, show me how to be in service to this conversation. Just let me be in service, and thy will be done through me and not mine, because oftentimes mine's fucked up. Sorry.
to put it in technical terms.
That may not be the right thing to do.
and just to acknowledge that I suspect all of us did, but for myself, yes, I too took a moment and offered it up in the hopes that whatever came from our conversation would serve the good welfare and awakening of all.
Yeah.
Yep.
Colette, you are such a joy. You are such an absolute joy. I just love what you just shared. Thank you. Yeah.
Amen.
Amen. That was really, there's so much in what you said. That was great.
Really touched by it. I'll add just a couple of brief postscripts, and that really, because you just, boy, that's impressive. You covered a lot of ground in there, and it resonates so powerfully with it. It's just such a pleasure to hear you articulate it. John knows this, and I discovered it in my own recovery, is that it evolved for me from the early days of doing it just to kind of hold stuff together. And I remember it turning to where, no, I'm actually doing this as an end in and of itself. It's like, no, I want a vital life. It's not just about not drinking or drugging. It's like, I want a full life. And then what went into that was an awareness that there were things inside of me as for you. Oh, by the way, just a little digression. I love what you said about 2 years ago, beginning to do the next level of work on whatever happened to you at age 19, for which I'm sorry to hear that. I work with clients, and you do too, that are across the age spectrum, but I work with clients who in their 40s or 50s or 60s will say to me, why did it take me so long, Bob? And my response is this: did you have any awareness of how many people live their entire lives and never get to this that you're getting to right now? Consider it an incredible grace that you've been given this opportunity at any age, because it's very possible to go through this entire life and never get around the corner on this. And so I feel that. I mean, it's like you and I are still working till the day that we die. We're still working on things and clearing it out. And what a grace that is. So speaking of grace, the postscripts are two for me. One is, we've already talked about this, because I had so much mortal shame, which wasn't around my not having fucked up, because I had. It was it was left me with the idea that there was something about me that was broken or fucked up, and I had serious work to do on that. And I had the good chance. John knows this. I was very involved in 12-step fellowship, working with sponsor, working the steps. That wasn't enough for me, so I got involved in refuge recovery, which started here locally, which is a Buddhist mindfulness-based recovery. And that wasn't enough, so I worked with John in integral recovery. I had to have 3 different recovery organizations, and just barely. But what I discovered along the way, and I got this from the Buddhist tradition, was a forgiveness practice that I adopted very early on. And as John knows this, in fact, John's helped host this on I Awake, is that the forgiveness practice has been a daily practice for me, which includes, as you were saying, for you, Colette, an inventory, a daily forgiveness practice, which many more days than not for the last 11 years of my recovery. I will oftentimes tell people that this has been the most singular, the most impactful practice of anything I've done has been the forgiveness practice. And I say that, qualify that by saying, I don't think everybody has the mountain of shame I had, but that was what I was up against. And as I said earlier, I felt like it was going to do me in. So for me, to begin to practice not only asking others for forgiveness, which I got in the program, as well as granting forgiveness, but most important to others, but most importantly, beginning to experience self-compassion. It came out of this practice for me, and I still practice it every day. I don't see a time that I won't do that, which makes me think. Some clients will say, all of these practices, Bob and Colette, they seem awfully burdensome. And I will assure them that it's quite the opposite of that, is that when you experience the lightness of burden that comes from practices like this, you'll realize that everything else is burdensome in comparison to them. So I engage every day in a number of practices, none of which feel like, oh my gosh, do I have to do forgiveness practice today? It's never like that. And by the way, I never run out. It isn't like I wake up and I go, I'm stumped, like, what am I going to work on today? There's always stuff that's processing. So the one postscript has to do with forgiveness practice. The second has to do with, John, you and I just published this on I Awake, has to do with another aspect of grace. If grace manifests as self-compassion, grace for me also manifests in the daily practice, and I got this somewhere along the way, and it kind of evolved for me. It's daily gratitude practice. Yeah. And it's an odd thing to say, Colette. I'll say this to you and I, being in recovery. My moral inventory every day is quite complex. It's quite automatic at this point, but it's actually built into my gratitude practice. It's an odd marriage for me, is that I'll review my various addictions. By the way, substance was just one of them. I've got a whole series of things that I'm vulnerable to and want to keep my eyes on, and I'm open about that with clients I work with, is I express gratitude for anything that I did yesterday. I just do it in 24-hour increments. I literally do it every morning. How did I do yesterday with my tendency to people please? How did I do yesterday with my tendency to want to buy things I don't need? And so on it goes. And I go through that every day. And many of them I feel really grateful that I made progress. And the things I didn't, my gratitude is that God hasn't given up on me, and today I've got a new day to work on these. And so gratitude practice for me across the spectrum, from my sobriety to security I experience in my life, in relationships, connection like today, opportunities to contribute like today, anything that moves me in the direction of fulfilling what I see as my purpose on this planet, all of that, I express gratitude. I do it every morning because it sets the tone for every day. So I wanted to mention those two things. Forgiveness practice for me, which is always kind of I always think of a pipe cleaner. It's kind of keeping stuff cleared out. And gratitude practice, which is, I wake up in the morning kind of grumpy. And I'm not proud to say that. But as I wake up and move into gratitude practice, I get degrumpified and I move into the day. And typically, I feel really grateful to be alive. One of the things I do every morning is I I go through every client I'm going to see that day. My work is recovery coaching, and I spend some time with each client expressing gratitude. And I don't do this by rote. Feeling gratitude for being able to be with that person today. And in the spirit of what you said, Colette, and you too, Roger, may I be clear enough of self to provide something that might be of worth here. I get the chills right now with it. I do that every morning, so it preps me for my day. So I don't go into my day going, oh, geez, a day of clients. It's like, wow, look at what I get to do today. So that's my addition.
I love that you said that. Look what I get to do today. I do that every day. And I get up before my husband. I'm up at 5:30 with the dogs, whatever. And even before I get out of bed, my hands on my heart, just saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. That's what I do. I just say thank you, because I believe gratitude is the abracadabra. That's how we create reality, is through that and forgiveness, because without forgiveness, we carry a lot of baggage around with us, and it can creep up on us. And they always told us, in recovery early on, that resentment is the #1 offender, but it can be resentment of self too, right? That shame creeping back, or that, I didn't do it right, or whatever. It's just like, there's that forgiveness is so important, so crucial. I'm glad you brought those two things up, because those are two core things.
Yeah, I'd like to just comment on that. And this goes back to the 12 steps and, integral recovery. What are we going to do now? The problem's getting worse in the world, et cetera. Well, there has to be an acknowledgement of, foundationally, the eternal verities: forgiveness, gratitude, service, love. It's not all about you. Francis prayer, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. These things, however that's manifested, it comes down to it. In my deepest spiritual explorations, I keep coming back to the same things, and that Sufis would agree with, that Buddhists would agree with, that Christians would agree with. It's there, and that has to be kind of the starting place, however we do it, and it's that makes life worth living, and is the answer, well, why don't I just drink myself to death? Well, because gratitude, forgiveness, service, love, it's not all about you. You matter. And if you do that, that's going to hurt other people, because if you get your act together, there's a lot of good that you can do in the world, whether it's just setting up the chairs, making bad coffee, or listening to other people's pain. There's a path for you to walk, and stay tuned. More will be revealed, right? So
thank you for this great conversation.
Yeah.
Me too.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Colette.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really, such an honor to meet you, Colette. It's been such a
Oh, ditto. This was a great conversation. I have to bounce. They're now. I'm 5 minutes late now.
all right.
Thank you.
hey, Colette, thank you.
Thank you, Colette. Yes.
These podcasts, you can listen to them many times, and I think there's a lot on here.
I think we said a lot. Yes.
Indeed.
And let's talk again about doing another thing, like energy flows.
God bless you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank
Nice
you.
meeting you, Robert. Nice to see you again. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Colette.
You too, Colette.
Well, let's see. We've covered an awful lot of ground today, from an acknowledgement of the universality of addiction, that it's part of our human nature, to the realization that there's an enormous spectrum from being hooked on chocolate to having one's life devastated by some truly horrendous, life-shattering addiction. And we've also covered a variety of recognitions of the roots of that trauma, role trauma plays in that, the necessity of a multimodal approach. And of course, John, that's your life work. You wrote the book, Integral Recovery, which brings together all the different modalities for recovery, and you've founded that movement. So that feels a very important emphasis, to recognize that we, as both individuals and a society and a civilization, now are going to have to work to reduce addiction and to cultivate healing in many, many dimensions. And a lot depends. A lot of individual lives are riding on this, and quite possibly our civilization is riding on it too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Roger. That you nailed it.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
Such an honor to be with both of you.
Ditto.
Such a pleasure, and John, as always.
Yeah.